My name is Winnie Li, and I'm an author and an activist. My book is called Dark Chapter, and that's a novel inspired by my own rape. And I'm also the co-founder and artistic director of the Clear Lines Festival, which is the UK's first ever festival dedicated to addressing sexual assault and consent through the arts and discussion. So I grew up in New Jersey, and I think as a kid, and still now, there's two things I've always been really interested in, and that's travel and storytelling. So when I was a child, I loved reading stories and writing stories, but I didn't get to travel very much. So my parents said that as the child of Chinese immigrants, I was going to have to study really hard. So I did, and I got into Harvard, and I studied folklore and mythology when I was there, specializing in Celtic languages and literatures, because I was always really fascinated by Scotland and Ireland, growing up in suburban New Jersey. And then I ended up getting a fellowship to study in Ireland. So I moved there, and then when I was in Ireland, I volunteered for a film festival, and I got involved in, I got really fascinated by film. So I told myself I'm going to try to move to London, which I thought was an amazing city, having visited there once in a while. And I was going to try to move to London and see if I could work in the film industry. So I did that, and at 23 I moved to London and started interning for a film producer. And then eventually, after about 6 years of working for her, I was starting to associate produce our feature films. We made a short which got nominated for the Oscars, so I went to the Oscars. Got Harvey Weinstein, nothing happened. And then I was working towards becoming a full producer on my first feature film as a full producer. But then everything changed quite suddenly. So in 2008, I'd been invited back to Belfast to attend a series of events that were commemorating the 10th anniversary of the peace process in Northern Ireland. So at the end of my stay in Belfast, I had a free Saturday to myself, and something I like doing when I travel is to see if there's a hike nearby that I can go on. Because remember, I'm somebody I've loved traveling my whole life, and I particularly love the outdoors, and for me there's nothing more liberating in being in the outdoors on my own, trying to follow a trail. So I had my Lonely Planet guidebook, and it recommended a walk which started in the west of Belfast, the city park, and was going to extend up to the north through the hills around Belfast and to the north of the city. So at about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, I set out. I finally reached the city park, and I started hiking on my own. But it was a park at the beginning that had a bunch of families and people that were enjoying a Saturday afternoon. So I wasn't entirely on my own. A few minutes into my hike, I was approached by a young man, I suppose a teenager really, who said that he was lost and he needed directions. I thought this was a bit weird because obviously, I don't come from Belfast. If you speak to me, it's quite obvious I don't come from Belfast. And I thought it was weird that he was going to ask me for directions, but I did my best to try to help him out. And then I guess he was just using that question as a way to start to have a conversation with me. And I didn't want to be rude, so I chatted to him for about 10 minutes, and then realized I kind of really wanted to get on with my hike. So I said to him, well, I sort of want to be on my own, if that's all right. So he left, or I thought he left. But little to my knowledge, he actually kept on following me. So I kept on progressing further into the park, and it got more and more remote. And I didn't realize he was following me. And then I remember climbing up a slope and getting to the top of the slope and looking out and seeing this incredible view of the hills and of Belfast, and thinking I was finally on my own in nature. And then I looked down the slope, and I remember seeing him following me. And I remember thinking, okay, that's weird, and I'm in trouble. And I just realized that I was completely on my own. So at this point, I wasn't exactly sure what he was planning to do, but I didn't think it was anything good. And I continued walking, and I just realized I needed to run as soon as possible and get to maybe some open space where there's somebody else around. But when I got to that open space, I realized there was nobody else around, and I was kind of in this sort of wasteland. And he caught up to me, and the boy at that point said again that he was lost. And I remember telling him, listen, I already told you the directions you're supposed to go in. What is it you really want? And then he said, well, do you like to have sex outdoors? So the minute I heard that, I knew I was really in trouble and I had to get out of there. So it was like he flipped a switch and became suddenly really violent, from this boy who said he was lost to suddenly who was very aggressive and demanding and threatening. So a fight ensued, and I was punched in the head, and I was choked, and I couldn't breathe for a while. And somewhere during that fight, I realized, okay, this person's incredibly violent, and if I keep on trying to struggle, he's more capable of physical violence than I am. I realized I was actually going to have to change tack and, in a sense, give him what he asked for, because that seemed like my best chance of survival. It proceeded to become a rape, and I don't know exactly how long it lasted, but probably about 20 minutes or 30 minutes. And at the end of it, I kind of felt at least I had moved him away from physical violence. And maybe that was why by the end of it, he wasn't threatening or demanding anymore. And he actually just tried to have a conversation with me again afterwards, and then he left. And it was an incredibly surreal experience. And I remember at that point, I kind of had two choices, or I had two options in some ways. I could have continued on the hike, and part of me thought, yeah, I mean, I came out here to hike on my own to be in nature, and I know that calms me down, so maybe I should just continue on my hike and, you know, just try to forget this happened. But then part of me knew I needed medical attention because I'd been choked and punched, and I didn't know what had happened to me exactly in the fight. So I thought, okay, you know what, I need to actually call a friend. I need to stop the hike and call a friend for help. Before, I had tried to call a friend actually during that hike, and I didn't have reception. And I was relieved finally that wherever I was now, I did have reception on my cell phone. And I called a friend. So we had a really surreal conversation, and I said, hey, how's it going? And she said, yeah, I'm all right. I'm doing these things, and how are you? And I remember saying, yeah, I'm not too good. I think I've just been raped. And that was the first time I used that word. Obviously, it only happened a few minutes after my assault, but I mean, I remember, okay, how do I describe what just happened to me? I think the word is raped. And obviously that's a word that nobody ever wants to use or apply to themselves in their lifetime, but at that point I realized that was the word, and that was a word that I was gonna have to use to convey the severity of my situation. So the police arrived about 20 minutes later, and my friend arrived shortly afterwards as well. The rest of that Saturday was taken up by all these police procedures, right? Speaking to the police, giving them as much detail as I could, the forensic exam, and then later on I went to the hospital. And, you know, and the part of me that was a producer, the part of me that had traveled a lot on my own before, knew that, you know, okay, I should give them as much information as possible. And suddenly I'd gone from being, you know, Winnie, who had a life and had all these things, interesting things that she wanted to do, to a person who was giving information to the police because their goal was to try to find that perpetrator. So, you know, I did the best I could, but the forensic exam it's an awful experience for rape victims. It's very invasive to your body, and I kind of felt like, you know, my body and my mind were no longer my property. You know, if I thought about it that morning, I was going to wake up, I was going to go on that hike, I was going to come back, maybe, you know, meet up with a few friends that evening, and then, you know, go to sleep the next day, fly to London for this red carpet premiere, and suddenly that all completely changed, and I didn't know what to expect. And I was still going to go to that red carpet premiere because I'm not going to let this boy take this away from me, because I worked so hard on all these films, on this particular film as well, and this was our first red carpet premiere in Leicester Square in London, and, you know, it was supposed to be a thing to celebrate. So I remember thinking, okay, just because this boy raped me like on Saturday, I'm still going to go to this premiere on Sunday. You know, I had this gown that had been lent to me by a designer, and it was meant to be a celebration of all our work. So I had told myself that I should probably not try to hide this information from my friends. And there were several reasons to that. I suppose one was, you know, even a few hours after the assaults, I think the news of my rape kind of hit the radio stations and hit the news in Northern Ireland. And that was because the police were looking for my perpetrator. So, you know, they asked me to describe myself, and they asked me to describe him. So that news went out. And I think I knew from early on how drastically I myself had been changed by the rape. I don't think I would have predicted at that point how much my life would have been changed, but I knew, you know, it was kind of an instantaneous transformation. I went from being, you know, a 29-year-old who, you know, was, you know, very self-assured and confident and always loved traveling on her own, to kind of a shell of the person I was before. I didn't feel like I had any of my personality or my confidence or my self-esteem or any of the elements that made up Winnie. I was just a walking shell who probably looked like Winnie but was just kind of empty inside. So I still got into that gown, but I had all these bruises. So I just remember I asked my friends to help me with this kind of industrial strength makeup concealer to try to cover up my bruises. And I still went to the premiere. And the next day I woke up because the police in London were calling me and they wanted me to get some more photographs taken of my bruises, because a few days after the assault, the bruises become darker, so you can get better photographic evidence that way. So again, I followed their instructions because that's what you're supposed to do. Pretty much that Saturday onwards, I just kind of realized, like, okay, I have to cooperate with this police investigation, and that is like my job now as a rape survivor, or as a rape victim at that point. It wasn't so much that I was a rape victim and I'd been raped, right? Because thankfully I was 29 when it happened, and I was educated enough to know that I hadn't done anything wrong that had caused that to happen to me. But it was the shock of knowing that you're going about your life and you're doing what you want to do, and then suddenly this other person comes across you and decides to do that to you, decides to rape you, and then that your own life can be changed so much by the actions of one other person. And that year, a lot of my friends were also getting married, because I was 29, so it was the age of people, I was at the age when everyone's having weddings. So I just remember for, that year and the year after, I had to go to 6 to 8 weddings a year, and I suppose pretend to be happy for my friends who, were celebrating having found the love of their life when I was dealing with the aftermath of my rape. But I just remember sitting in my flat on the Monday and sitting down and just randomly Googling rape West Belfast, because I am a curious person. And it was all Chinese tourist raped in a park, and Chinese student, I wasn't a student at the time, but they just said that, Chinese student brutally beaten and raped by a teenage boy, right? So it was, it was all the stuff that kind of maybe sensationalized things a bit. And it was very strange for me, as that person, as the victim, to be reading stories about my own rape. And I remember listening to a radio talk show, and there was about maybe a half-hour show about my rape. Again, it was incredibly surreal to be listening to all these people, and that these people had no idea that the person they were talking about, the victim, me, was somebody who had had a life before and was getting to have a life afterwards as well. And so I actually just remember listening to a woman, and I'm sure she meant well, but she said, well, my heart goes out to that wee Chinese girl, because her life is now ruined. And I remember thinking, like, that's kind of insulting, because you don't know me, and who are you to pronounce that my life is ruined from now on because of this one person's actions on me. And I just thought that was incredibly damaging, for me to hear, but then also potentially for other rape victims out there to hear, and for people who in the future might have something like this happen to them and might think, oh my God, my life is going to be ruined. And obviously that's a very patriarchal view. My perpetrator ended up being arrested a few days after the assault. So he was in custody, and I was waiting for the trial to happen. And you can't really live your life knowing that at some point in the near future you're going to be stepping into a courtroom and talking in great detail about your rape in front of your own perpetrator. I just remember sitting in the witness room of the courthouse waiting for the jury to be selected, and I was just waiting and waiting, just terrified of having to go and testify. And then the barristers came in and they said, okay, well, there's been a development, and if you'll agree to reduce the counts, he will agree to plead guilty. And I remember thinking, like, what does that even mean? Because it was so legal. And I said, wait, so if I agree to do all this and he pleads guilty, does that mean I actually don't have to testify? And they're like, yeah, that means you won't go to trial because he'll be pleading guilty before the trial. So I was just like, yeah, well, of course, right? So again, like in the course of like a minute or two, things changed drastically. And I no longer had to testify, and my friends were overjoyed. I flew back 6 weeks later to come to the sentencing hearing, because I just sort of wanted to see the whole thing through, and that was the only other time I was in the same geographic room or same place as my perpetrator. And I remember sitting not too far from his family, actually, listening as the judge gave him a sentence of 8 years, which was seen to be as quite heavy as a sentence for rape in Northern Ireland, especially for somebody that young. He was 15 years old at the time of the assaults, and that is something that has always stayed with me, because I couldn't really understand how somebody that young could be that violent and that destructive at such a young age, and where did he learn that kind of behavior from, and how did he think it was okay to just do that to a random stranger, to me. So that stayed with me. September of 2009, which would have been a year and a half after the assault, I went to Southeast Asia and I backpacked on my own for 3 months. And I just told myself, like, okay, like, you're gonna do this. And I was fine. Nothing terrible happened, and I, survived, and I actually had an incredible time and got to go to, white sand beaches and make friends with random people, and that was really great for restoring my sense of, I guess, positivity in the world. So I mentioned most of my life I've always been into stories, particularly writing, and I knew somewhere at the back of my mind that I was going to want to write a book about what had happened to me, but I wanted to approach it in a way that hadn't been done before. And I specifically wanted to write a fictional book, a novel, which could look at an experience like that from both points of view, from the victim and the perpetrator's point of view. Because I don't think we think enough about where the perpetrator is coming from and what leads them to that behavior. And now that I've been on the receiving end of that kind of violence, I've kind of felt like I needed to make sense of what happened to me, and the only way I could do that is trying to make sense of the perpetrator's character. And I know very little about him, but I do know that he came from a broken family, he was illiterate, and obviously didn't have a very good upbringing, so maybe some of those factors led to his behavior, which then obviously changed the course of my life. And I started working on Dark Chapter, and I finished that. In the process of working on the novel, I became more involved as an activist on the issue. And something about writing a novel is incredibly isolating, and it's actually a bit lonely to just be writing. So I realized, well, actually, there's a lot of other people out there, other survivors, other activists, other artists who are really talented, who are creating art about this issue. And that art needs to be exhibited and seen, and the people that want to see the art are probably other survivors as well. So I just realized, well, actually just start a festival that creates that space for people to talk about sexual assault and consent in a very open and honest way. So in 2015, I took a break from writing my novel to start the Clear Lines Festival, and that was the UK's first ever festival dedicated to using the arts and discussion to address sexual assault and consent. We got decent media attention. Channel 4 News did a piece on this, but we had about like 400 people, 400 to 500 people come, who were all in some ways maybe passionate about the issue, or they didn't know much about it and they learned quite a lot from being there. And it was sort of an incredible opportunity for people that maybe are affected by these experiences and feel like they can't talk about it because of the stigma that we have around talking about sexual violence, share their stories and realize that there's other people out there and have that kind of affirmation. So it's 2017 now, and my novel Dark Chapter just came out a few months ago. And it's been getting a really good reception. I won the Not the Booker Prize, which the Guardian awards, and I've done about, 35 or 40 speaking events around the novel, and every time I speak about it, and obviously I talk about my experience, which prompted the novel into being, I'll always have another survivor come up to me afterwards and say, what, it happened to me too. And I don't think that's just me. I think that's just the need for people to have to share their stories and the need for us to talk more openly about it. So there's so many different ways in which our society and the people in it are affected by sexual violence, and this kind of refusal to talk about things and this silence and this lack of understanding only kind of in some ways leads to more damage. So obviously 9.5 years ago, when I had just been assaulted, if you asked me, one day you're gonna stand in front of an audience of people and share your story, or share it on camera for a bunch of people to see online, I never would have believed you, right? Because I never thought that my life was ever going to be able to recover from that kind of trauma and that kind of violence. And I think that is the potential that we have as human beings to make sense of the things that happen to us. And even if we don't fully understand it, to focus on the fact that there's a potential for recovery and that it may be a long road. It's, certainly, if I look at my life in the way that I thought it was going to go, and then this thing happened to me and I kind of went in this other direction, you are able to kind of reroute to a different path maybe, and it's not the path that you maybe would have predicted before, but it is still a path that has meaning and a path that can lead to more connection. And I think there is incredible potential for human understanding and connection there, and some of the strongest people I've met have been other survivors. So I think instead of seeing rape victims or survivors as being kind of weak and vulnerable, actually they're incredibly strong and they're resilient, and we should be celebrating that capacity for resilience. And recovery isn't a straightforward path. Like, there were times where I thought I was doing better, and then you kind of do sort of a U-turn. And like, I don't think we should be putting pressure on ourselves to recover in a specific way. But it does happen. It happens with time, and it happens with understanding and with sharing stories. And I think that's just something we need to concentrate on. I mean, yeah, there is always going to be, and hopefully there'll be less of it, but that violence is there. But if we can start to speak more openly about it, maybe we can start to understand the roots of that violence and to also address it and address our own paths towards recovery.